What if I told you that a single island, barely 5 miles long, holds the key to Iran's entire economic survival, and the United States has been threatening to take it for nearly 4 decades? That is the reality of Kharg Island. This tiny piece of coral in the northern Persian Gulf handles 90% of Iran's entire crude oil export capacity. 90% of a nation's oil revenue flows through this one location. And right now, American military planners are looking at it with a level of seriousness that has global energy markets on edge. This is not just another military target. This is the single most valuable piece of real estate in the entire conflict. And the United States has been circling it for months. Before we dive into the details, if you want to understand the real strategy behind this conflict, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We break down the military and economic dimensions of this war that most outlets ignore. You do not want to miss what comes next. Let us start with the geography, because without it, nothing about this story makes sense. Kharg Island is a small coral island in the northern Persian Gulf. It sits approximately 21 miles off the Iranian mainland. It is about 5 miles long and roughly 8 square miles in total area. To put that in perspective, it is about a third the size of Manhattan. Despite that tiny footprint, it has served as Iran's primary oil export hub for nearly 7 decades. The island has deep water access that allows the largest oil tankers in the world to dock and load directly. Iran's mainland coast is shallow and muddy. Supertankers cannot get close to the shore, but at Kharg, the water drops off sharply. That natural advantage has made the island indispensable. Iran has built an extensive pipeline network that pumps crude from its inland oil fields straight to this island. From Kharg, the oil gets loaded onto tankers and shipped south through the Strait of Hormuz. The overwhelming majority of this crude ends up in China. Chinese refiners have built years of business around discounted Iranian oil. So when we talk about Kharg Island, we are not just talking about Iran's economy. We are talking about China's energy supply chain as well. That adds a genuinely different layer of geopolitical consequence to any potential strike. The island's loading capacity runs as high as 7 million barrels per day. On a normal operating basis, roughly 1.5 million barrels of Iranian crude flow out through its terminals daily. It is heavily guarded by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. There are extremely strict limitations on who is even allowed onto the island in the first place. Analysts and journalists covering this conflict have started referring to it informally as the Forbidden Island. For a country facing a devastating multi-front war, Kharg is not just an economic asset. It is the single most important artery keeping Iran's entire economy breathing. Let us talk about why this specific island has become such a central obsession in American strategic thinking. The history here goes back much further than this current war. Back in 1988, decades before he ever became president, Donald Trump told a newspaper interviewer that if a conflict with Iran ever broke out, he would personally want to, in his own words, do a number on Kharg Island, go in and take it. That is not a detail invented for dramatic effect. It is an actual quote on record from nearly 4 decades ago. That tells you this specific island has apparently occupied a very particular place in Trump's own strategic thinking for the better part of his adult life. It is genuinely rare for a piece of geopolitical trivia to end up connecting directly to real active military decision-making decades later, but that is essentially what happened here. A private citizen's offhand comment to a newspaper reporter in the late 1980s ended up foreshadowing almost exactly the specific target that same person would eventually threaten as president nearly 40 years later. If you are finding this breakdown useful, please drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps push this content out to more people who need to understand what is really happening. And drop a comment below. Let me know if you think the United States will actually follow through on this threat. Fast forward to March of this year. The current war with Iran was already well underway. American forces struck military facilities on Kharg Island directly. They hit IRGC positions while deliberately sparing the oil infrastructure itself. Trump was explicit about that distinction publicly. He warned that the strike on Kharg's military facilities was meant to serve as exactly what one energy analyst called a warning shot. He told Tehran plainly that if it did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the oil infrastructure on the island would be targeted next. That distinction between hitting the military presence on an island versus hitting the economic infrastructure sitting right next to it is a pattern that should sound familiar from elsewhere in this conflict. It is essentially the exact same restraint American planners showed at other economically sensitive locations throughout this entire war. Just as strikes elsewhere along Iran's coastline were carefully calibrated to hit naval mine storage and missile bunkers while deliberately sparing oil export terminals sitting right next to them, the initial Kharg strike followed that same disciplined logic, degrading the military capability that could be used to threaten shipping while leaving the economic lifeline itself untouched, at least for the time being. That consistency across multiple strikes throughout the conflict suggests this was not an improvised one-off decision specific to Kharg. It was a broader, deliberate American strategy of maintaining economic leverage intact for as long as possible while still degrading Iran's military capability piece by piece. That threat did not stay quiet for long either. Just days after that initial military strike, Trump escalated his public rhetoric even further. He told NBC News that American strikes had, in his words, totally demolished most of Kharg Island already. He added almost casually that the United States might hit it a few more times just for fun. That specific phrasing, hitting a nation's primary oil lifeline for fun, tells you something important about how comfortable the American president has become using Kharg Island as a recurring instrument of pressure and psychological warfare against Tehran. By June, with tensions still unresolved, Trump had escalated even further. He posted directly that the United States intended to hit Iran very hard. He specifically raised the prospect of the country taking control of Kharg Island and other energy infrastructure assets entirely. He told his followers that at some point in the not-too-distant future, America would be taking Kharg Island and assuming what he described as total control of Iran's oil and gas markets. That statement alone represents a fundamentally different threat than anything discussed earlier in the conflict, moving from striking military targets on the island toward literally occupying and controlling Iran's entire oil export infrastructure directly. That shift in language from destroying to controlling matters enormously. Destroying Kharg's infrastructure is, in military terms, a relatively contained operation. The strike package goes in, does its damage, and leaves. Taking control of it and assuming ongoing management of Iran's entire oil and gas market is an entirely different category of undertaking, one that would require sustained physical presence, ongoing security, and some kind of long-term operational plan for actually running or overseeing an oil export terminal in the middle of an active war zone. That is a commitment on a completely different scale than a single strike package. It is closer to occupation than to punishment. Here is where the story gets genuinely complicated. That specific June threat actually got walked back almost immediately. Trump called off the plan to strike shortly after making the post. He cited progress in peace negotiations involving high-level Iranian officials, along with a long list of regional powers. Bahrain, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey were all reportedly working behind the scenes to broker some kind of resolution. That diplomatic effort eventually produced the ceasefire that briefly held through most of June, the same agreement that later collapsed after Iran struck the Everly and Kiku tankers. That specific sequence of events is worth dwelling on. It demonstrates something genuinely important about how this particular threat actually functions in practice rather than just in theory. The moment serious multilateral diplomatic pressure entered the picture, with an unusually broad coalition of regional powers all reportedly pushing towards some kind of resolution, the Kharg threat got shelved almost immediately. That suggests the American administration was genuinely willing to trade that specific leverage away in exchange for a real diplomatic off-ramp. That is a meaningfully different posture than a government purely committed to destroying the island, regardless of what else was happening around it. It suggests Kharg has functioned throughout this conflict less as a fixed military objective and more as a bargaining chip, one whose value lies precisely in being available to trade away the moment genuine progress toward de-escalation actually presents itself. If you have made it this far, you are a real one. This is the kind of deep analysis that most channels skip. They give you the headline, we give you the context. If you want to stay informed, please share this video with a friend. The more people who understand what is happening, the better prepared we all are. Once that ceasefire officially fell apart, Trump wasted no time bringing Kharg Island right back into the conversation. Speaking on the sidelines of a NATO summit in Turkey after American forces had already carried out fresh strikes in response to attacks on 3 separate tankers in the Strait, Trump declared the interim ceasefire officially over. He once again raised the possibility that the United States might take over Kharg Island entirely. He warned ominously that he had given Iran a little warning. Let us talk about why Trump keeps returning to this exact threat over and over throughout this entire conflict, rather than simply following through on it decisively one way or the other. That pattern itself tells you something important about the strategic calculation happening behind the scenes. Energy analysts have consistently pointed out that when it comes to Kharg Island specifically, the threat itself may actually carry nearly as much strategic weight as an actual strike would. One analyst put it plainly. For oil markets specifically, the looming possibility of an attack on Kharg matters almost as much as the attack actually happening, because global energy traders have to price in that risk continuously, regardless of whether the strike ever materializes. Every time Trump raises the Kharg threat publicly, oil markets react. insurance premiums for anyone still shipping Iranian crude spike. And Tehran gets a fresh reminder that its entire economic lifeline sits permanently one presidential decision away from being severed. That market reaction alone is worth understanding in more concrete terms. Oil traders and shipping insurers do not wait for confirmation that a strike has actually happened before adjusting their pricing. They price in probability continuously. Every fresh Kharg threat from the American president functions almost like a live input into global energy markets in real time. That is an extraordinary amount of economic influence concentrated in a handful of social media posts and television interviews. It is part of what makes this specific threat so uniquely efficient compared to almost any other form of pressure available in this conflict. A single sentence from the Oval Office can move oil markets and reshape Iranian economic anxiety instantly without requiring a single aircraft to take off. That is precisely the kind of asymmetric leverage that explains why this threat keeps getting reused again and again throughout the war, rather than being either fully executed or permanently abandoned. Think about it like a landlord holding a single master key to a tenant's entire building over their head, without ever actually needing to use it. The mere fact that the key exists, and that the person holding it has demonstrated a willingness to bring it up constantly forces the tenant to behave differently, to negotiate more carefully, to avoid pushing too hard, precisely because the consequence of that key actually turning in the lock would be so much more severe than almost anything else that could happen in the relationship. Let us do an honesty check here. There are genuinely serious risks and complications attached to actually following through on this specific threat that deserve honest consideration. Experts have consistently warned that an actual attack or invasion of Kharg Island could drive global oil prices up dramatically by curbing Iran's export capacity. It could provoke a severe and immediate Iranian retaliation, and it could put at real risk the lives of any American military personnel who might need to be deployed onto the island itself to actually secure it. One regional expert specifically warned that Tehran would likely escalate sharply if the island were ever seriously attacked or seized, intensifying strikes on American forces and on energy infrastructure across the broader Gulf region as a direct response. That warning deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as standard analyst caution. Iran has already demonstrated exactly this kind of response pattern at smaller scale throughout the earlier months of this conflict. Every significant American strike throughout this war has produced some form of Iranian retaliation against regional targets, missile and drone strikes on American positions in Kuwait and Bahrain, attacks on shipping in the Strait, strikes against Gulf state infrastructure viewed as supporting the American side of the conflict. If those retaliations followed strikes on individual military facilities and coastal outposts, the scale of retaliation following an actual strike on the single most important economic asset in the entire country would almost certainly be dramatically larger, potentially involving every regional proxy and every remaining conventional capability Iran still has left, specifically because a regime facing the destruction of 90% of its export revenue would have very little left to lose by escalating as aggressively as it possibly could in response. There is genuine financial modeling behind exactly how severe the economic shock would be. Analysis from JP Morgan indicated that a direct hit on Iran's export terminal at Kharg would instantly shut down most of the country's roughly 1.5 million barrels per day in crude exports. Rebuilding destroyed oil infrastructure of that scale and complexity would likely take years rather than months, leaving Iran's economy in a state of prolonged severe damage well beyond the immediate military consequences of the strike itself. There is also a documented gap between rhetoric and actual battlefield results worth being honest about. When American forces did strike military facilities on Kharg Island back in March, Iranian damage assessments circulated afterward by state-affiliated media claimed that most of the oil transport hub's infrastructure had actually remained intact following the strike, despite Trump's own public claims that the island had been totally demolished. That is a genuinely significant discrepancy. It highlights a recurring theme throughout this entire conflict. Presidential rhetoric about the scale and severity of a given strike does not always align cleanly with independent verified damage assessments afterward. That gap between claimed and actual damage carries real strategic implications of its own. It directly affects how credible the broader Kharg threat actually is going forward. If Iran's own damage assessments genuinely reflect reality and the island's infrastructure survived the March strike largely intact despite claims of total demolition, then Tehran has real reason to believe the threat against Kharg carries more bark than bite so far. That could embolden it to keep testing boundaries rather than treating the threat as an imminent credible danger. On the other hand, if that Iranian damage assessment was itself a piece of strategic messaging designed to Project Resilience and downplay the actual severity of what happened, then the true state of Kharg's infrastructure after that strike remains considerably more uncertain than either side's public statements would suggest. If you are still with me, I want to thank you for your attention. This is the kind of detailed, honest analysis that most channels simply do not provide. If you found value in this breakdown, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand the full picture of this conflict. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on whether the United States will actually strike Kharg Island's oil infrastructure. Let us zoom out and look at the strategic picture underneath all of these repeated threats. There is a genuinely coherent logic sitting beneath what might otherwise look like inconsistent back and forth rhetoric. Every single time this conflict has approached a moment of serious escalation, whether that is the initial outbreak of fighting back in February, the collapse of the June ceasefire, or renewed tanker attacks in the Strait, Kharg Island has resurfaced as the specific threat Trump reaches for above almost anything else available in the broader American arsenal. That is not really about Kharg being the most militarily significant target remaining in Iran. There are almost certainly other facilities that matter more in purely tactical terms. It is about Kharg being the single target capable of generating the most immediate, most universally understood form of economic pain. A threat that does not require explaining complex military strategy to be instantly understood by anyone watching. Everyone from oil traders in London to ordinary Iranian citizens immediately grasps what losing 90% of a nation's export capacity actually means in practical terms. That universal legibility is exactly what makes it such an effective psychological weapon. And it is that to how difficult it can be to communicate the significance of a strike on a specific radar installation or a command and control bunker buried somewhere along the coastline. Those targets matter enormously to military planners. But their significance requires context and explanation to fully appreciate. Kharg requires none of that explanation. Everyone immediately understands what it means for a country to lose 90% of its ability to sell oil to the rest of the world. That instant, universal comprehensibility is precisely what turns a threat against a single island into a message that reaches far beyond Iran's own military and political leadership. It lands directly on ordinary Iranian citizens who depend on that oil revenue for everything from currency stability to basic government services. That is exactly the kind of broad visceral pressure that a more narrowly targeted military strike simply cannot replicate. That pattern of restraint, threatening repeatedly while actually striking only the military facilities and deliberately sparing the oil infrastructure itself so far, tells you something important about the actual strategic calculation happening behind closed doors, regardless of the public rhetoric. Every expert warning about the consequences of actually following through. The oil price shock, the severe retaliation, the multi-year rebuilding timeline, the risk to any personnel eventually needed to secure the island, represents a real serious cost that has to be weighed against whatever additional pressure destroying Kharg's oil infrastructure might actually generate beyond what the threat itself has already produced. There is a meaningful argument that the threat has already extracted most of its available strategic value simply by existing and being repeated, constantly, forcing Iran into a permanent state of uncertainty about its own economic survival, without the United States needing to absorb any of the downside risks that come with actually pulling the trigger. That calculation could change quickly if this conflict escalates further, particularly if Iran continues targeting commercial shipping the way it has throughout this entire war. But as of right now, the pattern strongly suggests Kharg's oil infrastructure has survived, specifically because the threat against it has proven more strategically valuable, intact, than destroyed. Here's my honest read on where this actually leaves things. Kharg Island sits at the exact intersection of everything this entire conflict has been fought over. Oil, leverage, and the question of who ultimately controls access to the resources and waterways the global economy depends on. Trump's decades-long fixation on this specific island, dating all the way back to that 1988 interview, combined with a repeated pattern of threatening it at every major turning point. In this war, while consistently stopping just short of actually destroying its oil infrastructure, suggests this is a threat being deliberately managed, rather than one that has simply been forgotten or deprioritized. Every time this conflict reaches another inflection point, and based on the pattern established over the past several months, another one is almost certainly coming, Kharg Island is going to resurface in exactly the same way. As the single biggest lever available to apply maximum pressure on Tehran without necessarily requiring the United States to absorb the full economic and military consequences that would come with actually using it. Whether that changes, whether the threat that has been circling this island for months finally turns into the actual strike so many analysts have warned about, is going to depend almost entirely on whether Iran continues giving Washington the kind of provocations that have consistently preceded every previous round of Kharg-related escalation throughout this entire war. There is a genuine irony sitting at the center of this entire story worth leaving you with: the single most devastating threat available. In this entire conflict, one capable of instantly reshaping Iran's economic survival, has proven most valuable to the United States specifically by never actually being used. Every time it is raised and then set aside, it reinforces its own credibility for the next time it gets raised again. A kind of self-sustaining leverage that would arguably lose much of its power the moment it actually got exercised, since a threat that has already been carried out can no longer be dangled as a future consequence. That paradox may be exactly why Kharg Island has survived this long, relatively intact, despite months of escalating rhetoric aimed directly at it, and why it is likely to keep resurfacing in exactly the same pattern for as long as this conflict continues. There is one final piece of this worth sitting with. Every previous point in this conflict where diplomacy actually made real progress, the June ceasefire being the clearest example, happened specifically after the Kharg threat had been raised and then voluntarily set aside as part of that broader diplomatic effort. That pattern suggests the island's true strategic function throughout this war may be less about a target waiting to be struck and more about a bargaining chip waiting to be traded, one whose greatest value comes precisely from remaining available to offer up as a concession the next time serious negotiations actually get underway again. Thank you so much for watching this breakdown all the way to the end. If you want more content like this, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update. Drop a like. If you learned something new, drop a comment with your thoughts on whether Kharg Island's oil infrastructure actually ends up getting hit for real. And share this video with someone who needs to understand the full picture of this conflict. This is not just a war. This is a turning point in history, and you are watching it happen in real time.